Hope, strength, resilience. Where do we find it? Faced with one crisis after another, where do we turn? The answer is always the same. We find it in each other. Communities on the front lines, ancestral leaders, trusted allies and new friends. The young, the experienced, sisters and brothers across the globe. At Rainforest Action Network, we know the only way to face the biggest challenges, the only way to make lasting, positive change, comes from people coming together. It comes from people power. It comes from you, because you are Rainforest Action Network.
Hello, I'm Ginger Cassidy, Executive Director at Rainforest Action Network. First of all, I want to thank you for sharing your time and energy with us here at RAN. For 36 years, Rainforest Action Network has joined together with people like you to challenge corporate power and to hold banks accountable, and to stand in solidarity with those whose land has been stolen, whose labor has been stolen, whose water has been poisoned, and whose way of life is under immediate threat. We are in the traditional, ancestral, and current territories of the Ohlone and the coastal Miwok, and we are so grateful to live and enjoy these beautiful places. We name local indigenous communities because they have held relationships with this land for generations and have survived forced removal, ethnic cleansing, and countless broken treaties. Just as Ohlone continue to demand the recognition of their tribal rights, so do indigenous communities all around the world. Just a few months ago, I had the great privilege of joining with indigenous leaders from the Gnu and Honor the Earth in Minnesota in their struggle to protect their water, their wild rice beds, and to protect the future for all of us against yet another disastrous fossil fuel pipeline project, the Line 3 pipeline. That pipeline illegally cuts through indigenous treaty lands and waters, and its construction is creating human rights violations every single day. This is just one example of what we're up against, and it is just one example of how all these fights are connected. For 36 years, Rainforest Action Network has been connecting the dots between human rights to climate chaos to forest protection. Because as the climate crisis edges more critical every day, one fact is constant. There is no solution to our climate crisis that does not include keeping forests intact and standing. Today, you will hear some inspiring stories of how a relatively small group of staff with our partners have leveraged the enormous power of people like you to challenge the biggest corporations and banks on the planet. And it is your support that makes all this work possible. We protect forests and the climate, and we uphold human rights. But we can only do that together with you. Thanks again for being here. Now here we go.
There's no solution to the climate crisis that doesn't involve keeping forests standing and centering the rights of people on the front lines, whether that is indigenous peoples or frontline local communities who have traditional and customary rights to those lands.
From the Amazon rainforest to the Congo Basin to the tropical forests of Indonesia, these are the largest intact forest regions in the world and are critical for our survival. They create the clean air that we breathe and absorb the carbon that is exposed through the fossil fuel industry. Tens of thousands of indigenous and local communities rely on tropical forests, as well as they're the homes to thousands of plant and animal species all around the world.
A large part of why forests are falling in Indonesia and around the globe is because communities who have those lands, who have rights to those lands, are not having those rights respected. And so we're seeing industry coming in and taking lands without the consent of indigenous peoples, without the consent of frontline communities. And as a result, forests are falling at unprecedented rates. This is true in Indonesia and it is true around the world. And our efforts in our new campaign have really centered the need to uphold rights of communities as front and center for keeping forests standing and for addressing the global climate crisis.
What's at stake here, of course, is not just forests, but homes for millions of forest-dependent communities, stability of our climate, the security of water supplies for large parts of the world. And forests are vital to all of these things. Our analysis has shown that just since 2016, there has been over $230 billion from the financial sector going into companies responsible for deforestation and rights violations. And we have to cut this number. We have to get rid of that finance going into this sector.
For forest commodities that are expanding onto, indigenous lands, just like as the basis of their development, kind of across the different periods of that development, it's violating rights, right? From the beginning where they're encroaching on indigenous land, they're violating indigenous rights. They deforest that land, and then a lot of those communities are displaced, and then they become landless and become workers, where they're also exploited because, again, the company is trying to get land for free. They're trying to get labor for free and for very cheap to produce these very cheap products. So that's the system the plantation economy is built on, and that's also the system that a lot of industries are built on. And so human rights are being violated across the board. And really, what I've seen in Indonesia is all these different communities have been fighting their own fights, and we really need to be a lot more intersectional about our work. We need to build bridges between indigenous rights, indigenous communities and workers and unions, and also environmentalists. And that's really the vision, to really look at this system and attack it with the lens of building together and a different kind of system that works for those rights.
What does it mean to challenge corporate power? What does it mean to move a bank? To shift an industrial sector? How do we make lasting, positive change? We do it by coming together, by sending one clear message, by speaking in one strong voice. People and planet before profits. At RAN, we bring that message directly to decision makers. We bring the noise, we bring the facts, and we bring the pressure.
For the past 3 decades, we've been challenging corporate power and evolving and innovating our campaigns, going after the biggest brands and financial institutions that are driving environmental catastrophe around the world.
RAN takes on the biggest industries driving the problem. So when we identified palm oil as the leading driver of deforestation and rights abuses in Indonesia, we looked back and traced the supply chain to the US. And what we found was the snack food industry at the front and center of driving consumption of conflict palm oil. We have a philosophy of working to have people-powered campaigns and connecting people across the world to problems that are happening on the front lines of global deforestation. In the snack food campaign, we were able to move a vast majority of the snack food companies to take on leading policies to address their problems in deforestation, to center human rights, and to ensure that their palm oil supply didn't continue to drive peatland destruction and climate emissions. We dropped a 100-foot banner on the iconic Pepsi-Cola sign on the East River of New York, calling on them to cut conflict palm oil. We also showed up year after year at PepsiCo's shareholder meetings with our allies and frontline partners from Indonesia to deliver a message directly to their senior executives.
We go after some of the biggest banks, like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and Japanese mega bank MUFG, as well as some of the biggest brands in the world, like PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, and Cargill. These corporations are systematically driving some of the biggest rates of deforestation and at the same time extracting fossil fuels, which we are trying to shift and change by challenging their corporate power.
We know that for a fossil fuel project to get built, it needs permits, it needs insurance, and it needs money. And so what we're trying to do is pull back the veil on where that money's coming from and make it really clear to people that banks are actors in the climate fight and they need to be held accountable for the contributions they are making to climate chaos.
For decades, RAN has followed the money, researching and exposing the big banks on Wall Street, in Europe and Asia and Canada, that are bankrolling the fossil fuel sector. 3 years ago, we began to focus on another critical pillar that is supporting fossil fuel expansion, which is insurance. Insurance may seem like a very niche topic for climate activists. What does insurance have to do with climate change? But it's actually an invisible linchpin of the fossil fuel economy. You can't drive a car or buy a house without insurance, and it's the same deal for fossil fuels. Companies can't build new coal mines, tar sands pipelines, or oil refineries without adequate insurance coverage, and existing projects cannot continue to operate without it.
At RAND, we like to say that if you can stop the flow of insurance money, you can stop the flow of oil. By putting pressure on the insurance sector, we are literally able to stop pipelines from existing and from continuing to be constructed.
Insurance companies are supposed to protect us from catastrophic risks, but in the case of the climate crisis, they're actually fueling it, perpetuating our dependence on dirty fossil fuels. And it gets even worse. The hypocrisy is astounding. Insurance companies like Liberty Mutual are actually refusing to insure communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. People that have been hit by hurricanes or in wildfire regions are actually struggling to get insurance coverage, or their rates are being totally jacked up.
I've had the privilege of working on the insurance campaign, and in July of 2020, inspired by the awesome digital organizing that happened to stop the Adani Carmichael coal mine, we also hosted a digital rally of ourselves. We were initially expecting that 200 people would come, and we ended up with 500. It was powerful. As we've been building power on the insurance campaign, we learned that our organizing is still effective, even in the time of the pandemic. In fact, the day before we held this rally, we learned that another insurance company dropped the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Zurich Insurance. And so that was a really powerful win to be able to tell to an audience of almost 500 people, who then continued to push Liberty Mutual by making calls and sending emails to the CEO and other important executives of the company that they too needed to drop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We know our organizing is going to continue to win in this movement. We've seen that 15 insurers have already dropped the insurance for this pipeline because of how risky this project is, and because of mounting grassroots pressure on the entire sector to drop all fossil fuel infrastructure projects.
The good news in all this is that financial institutions like banks and insurance companies are susceptible to public pressure. They care about their customer base and making sure that it's growing. Core to our theory of change is making our demands heard loud and clear, and building the reputational risks that insurance companies will face for continuing business as usual with fossil fuel companies. What does that actually look like? It means organizing creative actions outside these companies' headquarters, like giant murals and projections, banner drops. It is sending thousands of postcards to the homes of executives and their vacation homes, jamming up their online calendars with meeting invitations from activists across the country, educating employees about the dirty business that their company is involved in, and it's disrupting career fairs where they're recruiting and trying to get the next generation of their workforce. It's working with customers to cut ties with these fossil fuel financiers, and building a steady drumbeat of media coverage that really exposes the truth about the insurance industry's role in the climate crisis.
Climate change. It's here, and it's very, very real. Hurricanes, floods, and fires are getting worse every year. We know that two of the biggest drivers of climate change are fossil fuels and deforestation. And if you're in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. We need to stop fossil fuel expansion today. We need to stop burning down forests for profits today. How do we do that? We follow the money and we cut off the money. RAND shines a light on the biggest banks and the biggest insurance companies bankrolling climate chaos and profiting from planetary destruction. And we are demanding action now.
Rainforest Action Network has been one of the primary architects of global finance campaigns, going after the biggest financiers that are driving deforestation, resource extraction, and impacting human rights all around the world. This has been something that we've been known for as an organization and something that we've really built out over the past few decades with our partners and coalition members.
We've done things like bird dogging the top executives, Jamie Dimon.
JP Morgan Chase has an indigenous rights policy and yet continues.
He knows our name, he knows our faces. I think he even knows my voice.
JP Morgan Chase is a giant and we will move them to stop line 3.
We're not going to let them get away with this. They're going to see us. They see us in public. They see us in public events. And it's not just the CEO, it's all the top executives. We're showing up literally in their neighborhoods. We're showing up in their home communities. We're showing up at their bank branches. We're showing up in the media. Every way possible, we're infiltrating the different ways that they receive information in places where they are. And I think that's part of the effectiveness of RAND campaigning, specifically on the banks, but on the insurance companies.
These companies all care about what their consumers think of them. They want to be seen as doing the right thing. And so RAND supporters have taken action in a lot of ways, whether it's talking to them through their social media channels, delivering petitions to them, showing up at their offices and protesting and asking them to commit to stopping deforestation.
I see it with young people everywhere that our collective organizing power moves systems. We move entire sectors just by getting people power to show up at financial institutions and demand systemic change, to show up at the front lines of the climate crisis and put our bodies on the line to protect water, life, and land. Young people are coming together, and we know that there's a role for every single person in this movement. And together, we are here to create movements that are deeply motivated by our values, by our hearts being on the line to protect this planet, by our deep connection with each other, and knowing that another world is possible.
Just 3 years ago, the Japanese banks had no policies on forests. And now, after RAND's campaigning, we've secured major new policies by all 3 banks. And this is starting to have an impact on the ground in the places that we work.
The major banks and companies in Japan are major drivers in global markets. And that means they are also major drivers in industries that destroy forests and impact our climate.
We look at bank funding for tar sands oil, Arctic oil and gas, fracking, alongside coal, mining, and coal power. We look at how banks are contributing to human rights abuses on the ground via case studies of particular projects or companies. And we look at their policies. What are they saying that they will or won't do in each of those sectors?
Our Forests and Finance platform is a groundbreaking open source database. It gives RAND and our allies a powerful new tool to cut off the money behind deforestation. It reveals deal-level data about bank and investor connections to the 300 largest companies driving deforestation in the palm oil, beef, soy, pulp, timber, and rubber sectors across the world's tropical forests. It's essentially a global hall of shame exposing the banks fueling this crisis, making them accountable for their actions.
We know the single most effective way to protect forests is to support indigenous rights. We know that local communities and native leaders have been fighting against fossil fuel companies for centuries, working with people directly impacted by corporate greed, working with allies across different sectors, challenging corporate power together. That's the RAND strategy. But we can't do that without the trust of our partners. Our relationships are the foundation of our work. supporting leaders on the front lines and the fence lines from South America to North America to Southeast Asia. People defending their families and their culture. People protecting forests and our climate. People like you, making phone calls, signing petitions, and showing up in the streets in solidarity across the country, across the waters, across the globe.
We know we cannot do this work alone. That's why partnerships are so critical and why network is in our name.
Part of the critical work of RAN is actualizing the partnerships on the ground. We saw the things that were unfolding on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation with the Dakota Access Pipeline, and we stood in solidarity both on bank finance campaigning, so who were the funders of the Dakota Access Pipeline and supporting that research and building out that network. But we also sent a delegation on the ground. And we went there to actually camp at a camp that then was removed by the police. So our role shifted very quickly from being a direct action role to a support and cleanup. So RAN's diversity and understanding of what is needed, both in the movement and in partnerships, is a critical part of the core of our work.
We come there because they know that the biggest threat to these pipelines is people power. When we go out there, we have to trust the Indigenous women and the Anishinaabe elders that have been fighting this pipeline for almost a decade, that they know the way to protect their water and they know how to protect their wild rice beds.
RAN really sees that vision of both the 30,000 feet and then down on the ground. And I see us as a key bridge builder within the ecosystem of the broader movement. RAN's a mid-sized organization with big ideas and big ambition, but we don't do it alone. And I think that's part of the beauty of the network that we work in. We're working with the frontline and fence line communities. We're working with other NGOs and nonprofit organizations. We're working with Indigenous communities that are directly impacted by the projects and following their leadership of things they've been working on for decades, if not centuries. So moving from the public lands, and then now we've doubled down on finance.
RAN's campaign analyzes the finance going into the three main tropical forest basins, so the Congo Basin, the rainforests of Southeast Asia, and the Amazon. Our analysis has uncovered the main sources of that finance are from banks in the US, China, Japan, UK, Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And it's these financial sectors that we're targeting to cut the money off to deforestation.
What we found was that in the 5 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted, the world's 60 biggest banks poured $3.8 trillion into fossil fuels. And overall, the trend of that last 5 years is still going in the wrong direction. It's still going up.
Facts, data, impeccable research. That's what RAN brings to these fights for our future. RAN produces some of the most detailed and groundbreaking reports in the field. Every year, our data is being cited more and more by the biggest news outlets. We uncover who's financing fossil fuels. We identify who's connected to forest destruction. We find out who's profiting from climate chaos. And we tell the world.
We start working on this report 8 months before it comes out because it is no small feat to track tens of thousands of deals going to fossil fuel companies across 60 banks. So we use the Bloomberg terminal here in the office, which is the same software that traders use on Wall Street. We use it in a pretty different way, where we're trying to pull back the veil and uncover, which banks are funding which particular projects and companies. We look at the world's 60 biggest commercial banks all across the world, from the US to Japan to China to Europe. And we look at how they're funding fossil fuels overall, but then we also dive in on who are the biggest funders of tar sands, who are the biggest funders of coal, and really paint that comprehensive picture of how banks are funding fossil fuels. We see the numbers from this report get used in the media on almost a weekly basis. The banks have to take it seriously. It's the best calculation out there of their contributions to the climate crisis.
A code red for humanity, That's how the leading scientists are describing our climate crisis. Increasing hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, unprecedented floods in Germany, the hottest temperatures ever recorded in Europe, wildfires ravaging California. Yet while pipelines continue to be built, millions of acres of the world's rainforests are intentionally set on fire. The very trees and peatlands that could absorb carbon and store it in the ground are instead burned, releasing even more carbon into our atmosphere, all in the name of profit. It's time to stop throwing gasoline onto the fires of climate change.
For young people like myself, we came into this world with the understanding that the amount of time that we have to protect this planet is running out. For people even younger than I am, who are 14, 15, and 16, what we're fighting with younger generations is not necessarily climate apathy, it's the paralysis and numbness that comes with not knowing what to do when we're faced with a crisis as large as this, in the context of a global pandemic, in the context of violence that's already at our front doors.
We have no more time for business as usual. The climate crisis is here right now.
The climate crisis is incredibly urgent. We get more and more messages every day from the UN to the IPCC about how urgent this crisis is. We don't have time for banks to continue funding fossil fuels. We need banks to end their support for fossil fuel expansion now. Many of the world's biggest banks have said that they support the goals of the Paris Agreement, and what we're really showing here is that the dollars that they're putting into fossil fuels still don't align with those words.
The way that we get their attention is through really, really clever and smart strategy. So there's a couple different pieces here that make this make sense, right? Like JP Morgan Chase is literally the largest bank in the world, but we know that if we can move them, it's going to have a ripple impact, not only through Wall Street, but internationally.
Divest, divest, get your money out of this mess. Divest, divest, get your money out of this mess.
We must radically transform our economy and the financial sector rules. While leaders pledge $1 billion or $2 billion here for forest and climate protection, the real world economy continues to pump billions of dollars a year into destruction. It's simply not sustainable. We must aim high and we must deliver.
Challenging banks and asking them to change their policies is still a bit new in Japan. This June, when we held a protest at the shareholder meeting of MUFG, which is one of the largest banks in Japan, dozens of young people and students joined the protest. It was amazing to see young and energetic faces there.
I think part of the importance of the RAND strategy is really addressing the human element of this work. The corporations are an entity, but there's people in those corporations that are making decisions, and we are appealing directly to those people. And in some cases, we're doing things like a frontline leader that is directly impacted by the issue may come, toe to toe with a CEO or a corporate executive, so that the executives can truly understand how their decisions in a boardroom thousands of miles away can be impacting Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities in such a harsh way.
When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the climate crisis became even more personal for people. Suddenly, energy companies were continuing to charge for utilities, even surcharging for utilities at a time when people couldn't even make their rent. And in the meantime, floods and heat waves and wildfires have been spreading all across the country, and people have been just trying to survive the climate crisis that has come to our front doors.
Far too often, resource extraction goes hand in hand with systemic racism. Human rights abuses, land grabbing, and economic inequity. And far too often, those least responsible for creating our climate crisis face the first and the worst impacts of climate change. But we will not let those responsible off the hook.
A lot of the times, local Indigenous communities don't know that this company is coming in on their land until bulldozing is already happening. They would go into the forest, go basically into their plot of area or where they're having crops or harvesting something, and they see that kind of a sacred site has already been bulldozed, or this part of the forest is already bulldozed. And for people who are not forest dependent, we think of the forest as just this abstract place, but for Indigenous communities, the forest is like a supermarket. If you bulldoze an area, it's like, oh, you're bulldozing aisle 3, where that's where our medicine is. And so it's really just a very violent way to infringe the rights of Indigenous communities. When companies are developing forest commodities onto Indigenous lands, they should be initiating a process called FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent, which, this is kind of the North Star for Indigenous rights and the international norm. And companies should be, asking the communities if they want this development. They should be completely informed what they're going to be losing, if they're going to losing their whole right to that land, as if they're selling it, or they're going to be renting it, or if it's something else. They also need to be free from coercion, which means they can't be intimidated, they can't be bribed, there can't be any kind of force of violence that pushes them to say yes. And this is actually what the companies do. They come in and they just use deception. They use all sorts of lies to kind of tell the communities or force the communities to say yes. And that's what violates the rights of Indigenous communities.
Indigenous and frontline communities are the best stewards of protecting our planet. Indigenous communities are less than 5% of the world's population, and yet they protect up to 80% of this planet's biodiversity. Working with Indigenous communities, working with grassroots organizations is integral to the work that we do at RAN, not only through the community action grants, where we provide support to communities that are fighting the fight, but also through our authentic partnerships and long-term partnerships. The reason we know that this is the right approach and an effective approach is because Indigenous and frontline communities are the best stewards of forests. To us at RAN, racial justice and climate justice are intricately linked. We believe that we are not going to be able to have any impact in the work that we do, either on climate or on forest, if we don't think about racial justice. In fact, if we don't center racial justice, we are not going to be able to make progress on any of those other areas. And the main reason for that is it is known, and it is being seen more and more, that the people who cause the least to cause climate change, the people that cause the least to bring down forests, primary forests, tropical forests, are also the same communities that are suffering the most from the impacts of climate change.
There is no climate justice without racial justice. When you look at systemic racism here in the US and around the world, you look at Black and brown communities being impacted on the front lines here, from resource expansion to Indigenous communities dealing with extraction on their customary lands. These are all issues that we all need to address if we're actually going to combat the climate crisis.
In addition to the climate crisis associated with fossil fuel projects, human rights violations are associated with fossil fuel projects almost everywhere where they are in the world. Fossil fuel companies are violating treaty rights, poisoning water sources, destroying Indigenous communities and traditional ways of life. Fossil fuel companies are building man camps, which are kind of transient camps for workers, which are almost entirely men. And these man camps have been associated with missing and murdered Indigenous women and sex trafficking. And so, these fossil fuel projects are existential threats, both to kind of our planet and humanity, and also to communities that are on the front lines fighting these projects.
Every year we include a few case studies that really demonstrate how this bank financing has real consequences. And we work with different frontline communities that are fighting a particular project or company and connect the dots, which banks are funding the projects in their area. We try to bring those stories to life and make the data seem like more than just numbers. Even 5 years ago, banks were really still in a place where they did not want to accept any responsibility for impacts of things that they financed, whether that was human rights impacts or emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And what we're seeing now is that they're being forced to accept responsibility for the things that they're financing. And I think that's partly, at least, because of this kind of work that we're doing.
I have seen the change over the years, how Japanese media covers these issues. It was good that media has been reporting and focusing on sustainability of the Tokyo Olympics. However, the media needs to follow up. We encourage the media to follow up the Olympic organizers' procurement failures pointed out by NGOs. They need to continue to ask questions and push for accountability from the organizers. I would like to spread Keep Forest Standing and its implications more in Japanese society.
A very specific way in which Rainforest Action Network partners with communities on the ground, frontline communities that are fighting against fossil fuel expansion, for example, or trying to protect their lands, is through a program that we have, community action grants. The point of community action grants is, in some ways, looking at philanthropy and grant making in a very different way, reducing bureaucracy around grant making and making dollars available where they're needed most, in the fastest and most streamlined way. We partner with communities in supporting their campaigns, as well as making delegations travel possible to international conferences. We also provide them with capacity building resources and tools, and community action grants make all those kinds of projects possible. At RAN, the Community Action Grant Program has been in operation for over 25 years. And so far, we have given out more than $4.5 million to more than 400 organizations.
We're a mid-sized organization with campaigners and organizers all around the world. I think we're one of the most effective and strategic and nimble organization that uses strategic campaigns to go after some of the biggest multinational corporations all around the world. Every single dollar counts as we're implementing our key strategies to go after the biggest ones.
As young people, we've seen the world crumbling around us due to climate violence and the climate crisis. And so what we're fighting is not necessarily climate apathy, but it's existential fear, existential dread, the sense of what can we actually do at 14, 15, 16, 20 years old to ensure that our planet is still livable for us and our future generations. What's really important for young people to know is that our organizing wins systems change. And when we come together, we put our hearts on the line for our planet and the climate and for each other. We push sectors, we win every single time.
But we're really small in comparison to the corporations that we're taking on. People always tell us that we punch above our weight, and that is definitely true. But we couldn't do this work, and it's not possible without support from all of you. And that's why you're a part of our network. And that's why this work you're supporting is so critical at this time. I'm excited to introduce you to Emily Seltzer with our development team, who makes all the magic possible behind the scenes, working with all of you in our network.
Hi, I'm Emily Seltzer, the Director of Individual Giving at Rainforest Action Network. I'm frequently asked by our supporters, how can we help preserve the beauty of this world? How can we keep species from going extinct? And how can we make sure that we have a livable planet for our children and grandchildren? We know that it takes work and resources, our deep, targeted research, our detailed, groundbreaking reports, and our corporate negotiation teams, all of our global media outreach. All of these efforts are made possible through your support. When we say every dollar counts, we mean it. It's only when RAN is stable that we can help the movement grow. So every dollar really does count, and our partners know this as well. Over the years, RAN has directly granted more than $5 million to more than 400 frontline organizations around the globe. It's an honor and a privilege to help our community make an impact. I have seen firsthand the urgency and passion of the RAN community. People like you who are committed to protecting human rights and protecting our planet. I want to thank you so much for your support, and I hope we can connect again soon.
I've been on the board for 20 years, but I have been part of this community for 35. And I couldn't be more proud to be part of a team that kicks the butt of corporations all the time for the planet, for the forests, and for the people. If you're looking for a place to donate your money where it's going to get the most done with the least, it's here at Rainforest Action Network. This team is stellar, strategic, and fearless. They get more done on a dime than any other organization I've seen. They've stayed nimble and fierce and effective. So it's where I invest my dollars.
Hi, my name is Chris Noth, and I'd like you to join me in supporting Rainforest Action Network, because the time for debate is over and the time for action is now. Only your support can help us to preserve forests, protect the climate, and uphold human rights. So it's time to step up, time to join us. Support Rainforest Action Network today, for the people, for the planet. Thank you.
I just want to say a big thank you to all of our supporters and partners who make this important work possible. It is so critical to have all of you here tonight. I look forward to seeing you soon. Good night, everyone.
Join us and let's build hope for a better tomorrow. You are the heart and strength of this work. You are creating the positive change this world needs. You are the Rainforest Action Network. From all of us to all of you, thank you. You can donate or find us at ran.org/give. Thank you so much for your continued support.